This is the business of Africa. If it's about Africa, then it's our business, bringing big and small business issues right to your doorstep. In January of 2025, barely 24 hours after taking the oath of office, the new old president of the United States of America set the proverbial cat among the pigeons. Donald Trump signed an executive order that included a 90-day pause in the U.S. foreign development assistance for, quote, assessment of programmatic efficiencies and consistency with United States foreign policy. That is but one excerpt of the executive order, which you can, of course, find on the White House webpage. But what exactly is international aid and how has its rollout impacted the African continent? To help us take a look at the business of aid, we're joined by distinguished professor of the University of Johannesburg, and that is Professor Patrick Bond, who has done extensive work around the issue of aid in Africa. Prof, thank you very much for your time. When we take a look at the African continent in particular, what is aid and what are the different kinds of aid that are channeled to the continent?
Well, thanks for having me. Great to be with the Moneyweb team. The main problem I think we're going to face is that this is extremely sudden. All sorts of programs, aid programs that USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, has funded for years in the case of antiretroviral medicines to help people living with HIV, really from about 2007. And in the course of a given year, $65 billion go from USAID, and a large chunk of that is frozen because of an order that went into effect. The new foreign minister from the U.S., Marco Rubio, basically announced on Friday that by Tuesday afternoon, things would have to shut down. He did some last-minute waivers. A similar process in the U.S. stopped a very, very strong set of cuts of budget support to similar programs in the United States from going through. So there's an extraordinary contestation over just how rapidly Trump and his main advisors on this, the two are Johannesburg-raised Elon Musk and Stephen Miller, his deputy chief of staff. And those three men are just basically deciding to chop through vast shares of the U.S. budget. And the U.S. aid budget, $65 billion, out of $6 trillion is practically nothing. But if you can imagine an African emergency relief system or AIDS medicines or any of the other programmatic work that's being done just being immediately abolished, it's absolute chaos and very, very destructive.
Will this disruption also touch on military aid, project aid, and multilateral aid?
Yes, the two countries that are exempted from any military-related aid cuts are Israel, which is underway with apartheid in the West Bank and has just put a ceasefire on its genocide in Gaza. But they get the vast majority of this aid to Israel is military, over $4 billion a year. And in the last 15 months since the genocide really got underway, well over $20 billion. And then you have Egypt is the other, the only African country that will retain its military aid. There are plenty of other U.S. military relationships with Africa through AFRICOM. It's not clear if those are going to be affected because Trump has exempted the military from his aid cuts. But it's really the humanitarian and, say, the programs, including around things like climate change, where the U.S. has been the historic main emitter of greenhouse gases that's causing problems like the cyclones still ravaging Mozambique in the last few weeks. And those programs go on freeze. Now, the waiver that's just come into effect does allow antiretroviral medicines. And it's just a good reflection of the one program most controversial, PEPFAR, the Presidential Executive Program for AIDS Relief. And that program really lobbied for by activists, including South Africa's own Treatment Action Campaign. And the impact of its role, along with the United Nations Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, has been incredibly positive. That is, it's put our life expectancy, which had hit a low of 52 in 2004, back up to, we're up to about 65 at the moment. So that huge increase is entirely attributable to getting those antiretroviral medicines to 5.6 million people through the government. Those are generic medicines, not branded, so they can go quite a long way. And that's the sort of program that now I can safely predict, if it is ultimately cut in this 90-day review process, will do enormous damage. It will kill thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Then you've got the next set, some of them are emergency aid for countries, areas of Africa, Sudan, for example, where you desperately need humanitarian interventions. But then the next set are going to be very interesting because U.S. aid has what we would call a neoliberal ideology. That is, it believes in markets and liberalization of trade. So Africa should get rid of its protective barriers and get rid of exchange controls. And those policies that implement a sort of neoliberal agenda, those will also be in the short term cut. And that's going to be one of the things I think we'll all watch. Is the ideology of the United States changing from a corporate global neoliberal agenda of free markets and big corporate power, which we've known for decades, that's been U.S. aid's underlying agenda? Is it changing into the paleo-conservative, that is, the populist nationalist or isolationist, xenophobic, often racist politics? And because Marco Rubio, the man who set this in motion most directly, the foreign minister, comes to Johannesburg on February 2021, that is less than a month from now, a lot of people are asking, well, what is this G20 foreign ministers meeting going to be about when the man coming to visit from Washington has been doing such enormous damage?
How far back can we trace aid distribution to the African continent, at least?
Well, the original big aid programming from the U.S. was called the Marshall Plan, right after World War II. And George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, the foreign minister, put into place some big programs that mostly supported U.S. companies going into Europe. And the objective was to prevent communist support from the society and to bring over trade unions that had been communist leading at a time in the Cold War when Russia had a lot of prestige. The Soviet Union had played the main role in winning World War II against the Nazis. In much more structured forms. The World Bank was founded in 1944 and went into action in Colombia. A few years later, South Africa got one of the first loans in 1951. And then aid became much more, as you're hinting at, as big business. And not only do big corporations from the donor countries get these contracts. It's called tied aid. You take funding from us and you have to use one of our companies to deliver the goods, to build the infrastructure and so forth. And right now, China is one of the most guilty, I would say, of that sort of tied aid. But then there are a bunch of other, let's say, manifestations of aid dependency. And some of them involve big NGOs that have emerged and worked in every one of the different fields as, let's say, for-profit companies, but they're not for-profit. They take the profit out in other ways, high salaries for the chief executives and, a sort of luxurious lifestyle. And they do distort local economies in many of Africa's poorest cities where the NGO sector, you can kind of see them in the business sector and the diplomatic sector living in the nice parts of town and bidding up the prices of things. These are some of the ugly manifestations of aid. And I think the most important is when you get presidents, even as strong as Cyril Ramaphosa, becoming quite obsequious when even a Donald Trump is saying that he's going to put 100% tariffs on exports from South Africa, from BRICS countries, if they try to de-dollarize. And at that point, we don't want to see someone like a Ramaphosa simply bowing down to the bully and saying, hey, come for a round of golf when you're here in November 2025 for the G20 meeting, because after all, Donald Trump cheats at golf.
Stranger things have happened, Prof, so we might be right there taking pictures and reporting on it. But you've spoken about tied aid. Speak to us about multilateral aid. How does that work, and what are some of the pros and cons of it?
It's going to be very interesting to watch because multilateral institutions sometimes do have concessional finance. So the IMF and the World Bank will give loans with grace periods and very low interest rates to the LDCs, lesser developed countries. Now, will the Trump regime continue to provide aid in the form of basically ownership of the World Bank, the IMF, at the levels that are required to continue to recapitalize? We did see a little of that debate in 2017 to 2021 when Trump was in his first term. And he did hire as his World Bank president in 2019 the Deputy Treasury Secretary, David Malpass, who was at one point very much against the World Bank for the reason that it had this concessional procedure. Usually the World Bank makes money for the owners. It charges a high interest rate, but for these very poor countries, it simply can't. And that'll be a very interesting question because after all, the IMF, the World Bank are very important tools. They're power tools in the international financial system. They're managerial. They often are the brains of international finance. They can operate as sanctioning sort of vehicles. So whether the IMF and the World Bank continue to get U.S. support in the form of subsidies or capital investments remains to be seen. And because Trump is, as I said, an isolationist, even though his foreign minister, Rubio, is a neoconservative, more outward-oriented and aggressive, Trump says he's isolationist, xenophobic, and doesn't like spending money on foreign countries. Make America great again. That's all about the sort of national populism of the U.S. first. I suspect he'll be talked to and told, look, we actually do need U.S. control, a 17% voting share, and therefore a veto over the IMF and the World Bank. There are a few others. I mean, he's just dropped out of the World Health Organization, absolutely crucial institution when we have pandemics. And then he's dropped out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in that sense, he's also reneged on the United States' historic responsibility. They call it polluter pays. In fact, that's a term we use in most countries to say that there is responsibility, liability. If you've made a mess, if you've emitted greenhouse gases, you should pay. And Donald Trump doesn't want any of that. He's backing right out of the recent obligations made by his predecessor government, the Biden regime in Baku, in Azerbaijan, to make more payments for, in a sense, the damage done, loss and damage and adaptation and some of the other mitigation expenses. We're beneficiaries, as you know. We have a Just Energy Transition Partnership that $1 billion have come into from the U.S., although in that case it's basically guarantees to support U.S. banks making market rate loans. So it's not that good a deal, frankly. So I think these are the sorts of, let me call them devils in the details, we're all going to be looking at to see how this extreme disruption by Donald Trump plays out.
Absolutely. Let's revisit this moment in December last year when the former president, Joe Biden, was in Angola. This is what he said about aid in Africa.
As a permanent member of the G20 economies, and we insisted being all in on Africa means making sure African voices are heard at the tables that matter most. Under my leadership in the United States, we brought in the African Union as a permanent member of the G20 economies. And we insisted on more African representation among the leaders of the International Monetary Fund and other world financial institutions. We've also pushed to ensure that developing nations do not have to choose between paying down unsustainable debt and being able to invest in their own people. And we're using our own voice to increase Africa's presence in the UN Security Council at the United Nations. That should happen. You can clap for that, folks. You should be in there. The United States continues to be the world's largest provider of humanitarian aid and development assistance. And that's going to increase. You know, that's the right thing for the wealthiest nation in the world to do. And today, I'm announcing over $1 billion in new humanitarian support for Africans displaced from homes by historic droughts and food insecurity. We know African leaders and citizens are seeking more than just aid. You seek investment. So the United States is expanding our relationship all across Africa, from assistance to aid, to investment to trade, moving from patrons to partners.
Prof, this right thing that Joe Biden speaks of, who determines the priorities of a developed or so-called developing nation, more so when you speak, Prof, of the ugly manifestations of aid that distort local economies? And so who determines the priorities of a so-called developing nation?
Well, the golden rule is he who has the goal makes the rules. Joe Biden might sound generous and interested in the African voice, but to be frank, that was a lot of his exaggeration. Just for example, Narendra Modi, who ran the G20 in 2023, the Prime Minister of India, he was the one who invited the AU, and sure, the US had to agree to that. Or when Biden says that there are new seats in the United Nations Security Council that the U.S. has proposed. He didn't say that those are Jim Crow. In other words, they're tokenistic because the seats do not carry with them veto power. And the two most obvious countries for those seats are South Africa and Nigeria. And so him telling this to Angolans and saying you should be there is another exaggeration. I think some of the other points he's making about having one more seat in the IMF are relatively trivial. And the real problem, what you'd see in the US economic agenda, is Biden being in Angola to set up the Lobito corridor connections, a rail line that goes to Zambia and then over to the eastern DRC. And of course, the contestation in the eastern DRC is in part because the US's traditional partner there, Rwanda, has put the M23 into action and taken over Goma. A dozen or more South African troops have been killed in the process. South African troops are there partly because there are lots of South African mining houses that want to be there. So one has to be quite cynical and skeptical about all of these relationships. And as you say, when the US comes knocking and says, oh, we want to have trade and investment, you should look under the hood. The example that will be on everyone's mouth in the coming weeks is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which does have concessions for African imports. And I'm surprised that Trump didn't get rid of that right away in his flurry of executive actions, because it does mean zero import tariffs for things like aluminium from Richards Bay, South Africa, cars from the Mercedes plant in East London, steel, even though it's in sharp decline right now, steel from South Africa, vineyard grapes and wine. And, these are the sorts of things that probably Trump will come under pressure from U.S. companies to also cut. So there'll be more protectionism. We should watch that space. They may use the excuse that South Africa supports Palestine against Israel in the International Court of Justice, or they may make an excuse that South Africa is a leading member of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Whatever excuse they'll use, I think we have to keep looking at whose economic interests are at stake in this.
It's so much. Then, Doc, you have some sectors of society that ask the question, do countries on the continent, on the African continent, need aid, assistance, or whatever term you want to wrap it around with, or reparations?
I'd certainly say the latter. Assistance, if it's defined by, as you heard, Joe Biden in that arrogant way, or Donald Trump as a very negative force, well, you have to really look twice and say, are we getting it? And when you have activists like Treatment Action Campaign saying we need PEPFAR, we need to have subsidized antiretroviral medicines and support for NGOs that really will help ordinary people raise that life expectancy because they have access to the PEPFAR medicines, I would look at that with enormous respect. However, a lot of that aid should better be replaced by reparations payments. Why? Because, first of all, there's the climate catastrophe. And if you have a polluter pays approach, as we do in our National Environmental Management Act, every country does, well, you should make that international. And those who have caused the climate crisis should be paying, especially those who have very little resources, the peasants of Mozambique, who yet again suffer more cyclones the last days. But I think the other aspect of reparations is, if you look at we call it unecological exchange between the raw materials that African countries are exporting. On the one hand, that is minerals, often in a country like this one, platinum, gold, iron ore, coal, and manganese are the five big exports. Those Western and some BRICS countries that take those in, they're not paying full value, and that's the unequal ecological exchange in which a non-renewable resource, the wealth of the country, the sovereign, sort of mineral wealth, is in decline. You do get income, you get some royalties and taxes, some jobs, some investment, but it's nowhere near the value of the lost resources. And so making the case, as some countries have, Nauru, for example, for its phosphates, that if it's being badly managed by Western multinationals or BRICS multinationals, then those countries should be considering how to pay back, because they certainly are not doing so in the manner that's fair. Even the World Bank will tell you, if you do, it's called natural capital accounting, and you look at Africa's outflow of its wealth through non-renewable mineral resources is far worse than the amounts that are trickling back in. The failure to industrialize means we're just stuck into this rut.
Is it fair, Prof, to ask the question, right, that, okay, you want reparations, you'll get reparations, and these are questions that are coming from some sectors of society on the African continent, where people are noting that even the aid that you get right now does not trickle down, perhaps with things like PEPFAR, USAID, antiretroviral campaigns and treatment, that we can see a tangible result. But there are other aspects of aid where people perceive it not to to reach their own level. And so now when we also add reparations, people don't trust that it will do that which it is supposed to do, which is fundamentally change the lives of the people on the ground. Is that a fair question?
Oh, it is absolutely. I mean, there'll be some book on this about the aid agencies and the industries that grow up around them that help the West, but they're local allies who become, quite corrupted characters sometimes in the process. So what would be a solution? I've found a couple that are very compelling. One relates to leaving fossil fuels underground and paying a country to do so because it's in the global public interest. And South Africa has been one of those JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership countries, but there are much better examples. The one in the border of Ecuador and Peru, it's called Yasuni, and it's a project to plow back funds from the West into local conservation. There's plenty of that in small scale, and the second version would be probably best piloted in Namibia, where in a place, Otjivero, about an hour to the east of the capital of Windhoek, the Germans, specifically the Evangelical Lutheran Church, a progressive church, have for long tried a basic income grant in a village as a pilot to give everyone in the village. And this is mainly a women-headed household village because the men, like in many rural areas of Africa, are in migrant situations where they're looking for jobs in the bigger towns or in the cities. So the Germans were giving 10 euros per household, per person, per month in these women-headed households. And all of the research that was done on what could be done as a sort of people-to-people reparations using this strategy of the German Evangelical Lutheran Church, along with good groups, NGOs and labor in Namibia. And they really found a great success. The question is, could we expect the Namibian government to get money from Germany? Obviously, Namibia's owed reparations. And Angela Merkel, the former chancellor, said, we do finally recognize the genocide that the Germans committed against the Herero and the Nama people back in 1904 to 1908. We will increase our aid. But then the question is, do societal forces have the power to set up something of this sort where you can actually go to individual bank accounts, maybe fire up a little plastic card with funds every month from a German donor agency? That's not impossible to imagine because we have such sophistication in fintech these days. So these sorts of things to maintain and manage and avoid corruption and avoid big administrative charges, they're not impossible. We just need more creative ways to think about it. Maybe that's one of the side effects of what Donald Trump is doing. He's actually forcing us all to say this is a system that is untenable and based on quite a pernicious dependency relationship. Let's see if we can restructure it and get a better system into place.
To that point, the African Union or any other continental body, is there a continental body that can do that which might be taken away, right? So that can plug the gap when it comes to military aid, project aid, humanitarian aid. What can be done here on the continent? Can't we do it ourselves?
It would be great. I mean, the model for the AU was the European Union, and in many ways I would trust programs that are developed to help society through the EU to reach their targets and to, based on, the EU has democratic voting for its regional parliament. We don't yet have that, and we can't even seem to get the African continental free trade area up and running because the interest in having border and tariffs that fund the state under conditions of extreme pressure right now. We have countries bankrupted like Zambia and Ghana and Ethiopia because they can't pay their bills, so they're not really willing, and most governments aren't willing to give up customs duties. So we're still having trouble getting coherence. We haven't seen the kinds of visionary leaders that we'd wanted. I mean, think of way back in the day when these ideas started to come up from people like Kwame Nkrumah, and that was that original call for a full African continental state body, and it's now more than 60 years later, and it's very, very difficult to realize given the balance of forces. But there is something exciting in Africa that we see it in Mozambique, and people getting fed up with corrupt leaders who don't give them proper democracies. In Nigeria in August, the Days of Rage, the Gen Z in Kenya in June, July, and you get that feeling, don't you? And in South Africa as well, that there is a sort of sense that if this older generation isn't willing to operate in a more public interest and is continually finding little avenues to sort of promote its own particular interests or ethnic interests or personal accumulation interests, well, the people aren't going to be, let's say, accepting this Africa rising myth. They're going to be, let's say, Africans uprising against some of this.
Prof, as always, thank you very much for your contribution. Distinguished Professor of the University of Johannesburg, that's Professor Patrick Bond. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Business of Africa podcast, where we bring big and small business issues right to your doorstep. You'll hear from us again in the next fortnight, God willing. Bahaichu, Bula.